let's make a start. Okay. My name is Victor Mrinde. I'm the Executive Director of the African Economic Research Consortium, AERC. I bring you greetings from the AERC. I already see quite many familiar faces here. They are good people who are members of the network of the AERC. So greetings. Now, this is possibly a non-orthodox way of doing this panel discussion. We start with the presentation about the AERC. We are remaining with only 10 days to complete the 5-year strategy that started in March 2020 and ends at the end of this month in 2025. Within 10 days, we shall be embarking on a 10-year rather than 5-year strategic plan, 2025 to 2035. From April 2025 to March 2035. And that's a transformational journey. It's a journey of transforming, or in the words given here, reinventing the AERC to be the main engine for capacity building and informing policy for Africa's economic prosperity for the next 10 years. And that's what I will be sharing with you. And then after sharing the highlights of the strategy with you, then I shall relocate to join a distinguished panel, introduce them, and then we go into the question, the cut and thrust of the main issues, and then come back to you, the audience, to get further feedback and also some ideas to extend the debate further than the presentation. But also to provide input, the start of input, because the input is continuous into the journey that AERC will take for the next 10 years. Okay, so this is a transformational plan to invent the AERC in the face of all the changes happening around the world, economic changes, geopolitical, aid dynamics and relocation of aid and other issues that we shall be flagging up in the course of this debate. And where are we going? Okay. We know that the AERC has been in existence since 1988. And indeed, some of the familiar faces here are already part of the AERC network, and the network continues to expand. So the AERC exists both within Africa and also in a global context. We are building on the past achievements of the AERC, and these are phenomenal, both in terms of capacity building, but also in training. And there is a dimension that combines research and training, which is the policy engagement. There is already a lot of work on the ground. But we are making a step change, transformational change, in terms of where the AERC is going. The big idea is for the AERC to indeed become the locus, the hub of excellence for economics research, high quality training, and impactful policy engagement in Africa. We are not, say, inventing a version of the NBR, North America, or a version of CPR. The AERC is unique in terms of capacity building, more than a think tank, a unique body that blends the economics profession, the economists working in academia, the economists working in government, the economists working in the private sector, together to be able to shape the destiny of the African continent. That's the remit. And Of course, we have a lot to show about what the ERC has been doing for the last almost 40 years. Of course, we start, say, for example, with the alumni or the leaders of the ERC or members of the ERC network who have risen to prominent positions in government leadership, especially in economic policy, both ministries of finance, and you can pick some of the key ministers like Mutule Nkube, finance minister for Zimbabwe, and Adelaide Matichalane as a finance minister for Lesotho, but also actually previously central bank governor for that country for 3 years. Can think in terms of the governors of central banks, Mike Wating Ego, governor Bank of Uganda, Louis Kaseke, the former governor in the same bank, Innocent Mashe, also a Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, many of those, including those alumni who are shaping policy, doing the work of a knowledge intermediary between researchers and policymakers. Those are think tanks as knowledge intermediaries. And Rose Ngugi is an example in that. You have also people that have shaped both developments, Professor Njuguna Dungu, the former executive director of the ERC, and also still playing a role in Kenyan government. You have even our very own Professor Robert Modida here, who will be speaking here, and we highlight him as one of the eminent alumni of the ERC and who is now guiding the research at the Central Bank of Kenya. And this is a catalogue of a number of people, from those who are advising, like Jared Osolo or Albert Mwenda, and also chief executives of international think tanks like Jane Kaburu Maniara and others. This is just testimony. I could go on and go on. In fact, the list is long, the testimony of the success of the capacity building dimension of the ERC to build the capacity of individuals that are shaping the destiny of economic policy and economic development on the African continent. But it goes more than that. And the visions constantly look into shaping the ultimate goal, or the objective function, if I want to say, is the sustained economic development, the economic prosperity of Africa, underpinned by what ERC does, which is knowledge basing of economic development and economic management for governments, the private sector, and many other entities. And so the mission to the vision is to work through conducting independent, absolutely rigorous research into the problems pertinent on African economies. And we shall be igniting this page. What really are the problems? Are problems evolving so quickly that we are unable to capture them? Are we missing the key problems? Maybe, but we are trying to capture some on our radar. And then through a synergetic combination of research excellence with fast research plus with the feedback mechanism in that research ecosystem and policy ecosystems. And of course, combine this with interactive communications and cross engagement. That's how we move forward to achieve the vision. The strategic plan 2025-2035 has been exposed to many members of the network. So some of you may already have encountered or even provided input into how the strategic plan looks like. It was based on the decision memo that was shared with the board, and we just come back yesterday when we made a dramatic entrance into the session. We're coming back from meeting the board in Washington, D.C. And here are the main core areas of the strategic plan. Transformation of research offerings, reinventing graduate training on how we do master and PhD, policy engagement going beyond a simply dissemination of research to policymakers. No, there has to be policy engagement to be able to deliver and achieve the impacts required. Also looking into the governance structure. The governance structure has been the same since 1988, has delivered a lot of work, but of course, the dynamics require that we go back and look into the governance structure. Also, in terms of entrenching the network membership, have solid network membership that can enable us deliver mandates. And in the dynamics, it's as if we anticipated that the ground will shift. The ground in financing development will shift as it has done. So we look into enhanced resource mobilization for financial sustainability. Then there is also addressing the issue of inclusion, because AERC is Pan-African, to be able to cut across the continent of Africa. And we share common ground with another organization called Economic Research Forum, which addresses research in North America. But we do collaborate with the rest of the continent. We share. And as far, in fact, south of the Sahara and not necessarily north of the Limpopo, we go down up to the end of, say, South Africa. And then, of course, we also look at the possible risks. And that's, I'm going to highlight some elements of these 8 areas very quickly in the interest of time. The research offering. A lot has been done in research, especially based on thematic research. We had groups A to E, and quite a number of familiar faces I can see here have been involved either as resource person, and I acknowledge Professor Jamano Mabu and Andy Mackay and others who have been very instrumental resource persons in ensuring that groups A and E get, deliver the work. There are also a lot of collaborative research where we get senior researchers across Africa, work with policymakers, address an issue broadly initially, and then go into country by country specifics. And that has worked very well. We pick the best elements of success from thematic, which is capacity building and mentoring. We pick the best element from collaborative research, which is co-authoring. And then we built an integrated research program, large enough to be able to build the two elements and to weigh in as much as possible from the researchers within Africa, at all elements, senior researchers, early career researchers, doctoral students, to be able to work with senior researchers and global name recognition researchers who are based outside Africa, either diaspora or just as researchers, eminent researchers who have an interest in Africa, and then build a program. And we start with one example program so that we can now have a framework of templates on how it works. This is like a piloting with first one research program. And after piloting, we are able then to go and work on the other programs. On that, the keystone will be to identify what are the key ideas. We'll come back to this on discussing what are the key ideas. We just flag up some of the ideas now on our radar, including a government institution, economic fragility, where the number of fragile countries in Africa is going up day by day. I don't have to give examples here, but in Central Africa and Eastern Africa, fragility rate, how then can we be able to address? How should economists, trained economists, be able to maintain or reduce economic fragility in that case? The case of industrial policy, if you spoke about industrial policy 20 years ago, they would say there's something wrong in the way you behave. But of course, after COVID, everybody's moved, most industrial countries moved into industrial policy. For Africa, it is imperative. And we want to see how the growth strategies can combine with industrial policy, some of these, unlocking Africa's digital potential. The biennial last year, 2024, was on the fintech revolution in Africa. And quite a lot of practitioners, fintech firms, researchers who are leading in the fintech area, combined in Nairobi to look into this. So there are quite a number of areas. In this discussion today, we're going to call upon our eminent panelists, together with yourself, to shine a spotlight into some of the key areas. We as the AERC should not be missing what is on the radar. We should be able to follow up and constantly monitor the urgent areas that need our research and input, among the network. How are we rethinking graduate training? What has been achieved by the AERC over the last 30 years is phenomenal. When I did my undergraduate at Makerere University, I didn't know even what was happening. The students at Nairobi University were in the same space. Dar es Salaam University. I didn't even know the faculty in those areas. And even my own faculty were not working with those. What has happened is phenomenal. A framework has been put in place where African universities can collaborate in especially master's training, where the faculty can collaborate in designing the modules, where they can collaborate in examining the modules, where they can collaborate in supervising PhD students. And that network is covering all economics departments across Africa and those in the network. However, what's emerging is to see whether this collaboration can actually be able to expand, especially to address issues of quality, completion rates, how long does it take to complete a PhD, the quality of immediate publication from your PhD thesis, that's the quality of the research from the PhD. And the transformation is that to move and break the trail in two ways. One is to work with our network collaborators in the global north, outside Africa, and to be able now to do a step change from being not only Pan-African PhD, but also working with the global universities to be able to see the areas of quality, whether it is at Oxford or to MIT or NYU. And fortunately, we actually have within the network members who are already working with on the research side. Okay, so the step change will be able to move that dimension to the training so that we can be able to co-design a PhD program that will be delivered jointly with our network members in the global north. That's on the PhD front. The twinning dimension, and I want to acknowledge a discussion actually from many members here, including Professor Modida here, including Professor Jamal Mwabu, who has had a hand in the twinning. The twinning would actually completely enhance step change in the quality of PhD work and also in the mentorship. The co-design of our professors in Africa with professors from the rest of the world. And that's where we are going to make the twinning PhD program. But also at the master's level, now to articulate, there is now a solid master's programs being offered across African universities. However, there is need for areas of intervention. Some of the African countries that have been underserved or addressing, participating in recovery from conflict, some states, to design a master's program that can quickly train people that can take on the policy dimension when the economies recover from conflict. That's a special master's program. And then on enhancing on the quality assurance of the training, beyond a simple, we call it simply external examiner system and others to actually enhance the quality, and also to continuously use the research, the huge research dimension we're working on, to make sure that that research is feeding into policymakers and continuous professional training, so that a PhD graduate who completed 10 years ago from AERC can continue to participate in new methodologies, new approaches, new data crunching numbers, movement to AIT and machine learning, still a currency, and that we can provide based on our research dimension. And in terms of policy engagement, impactful research, I acknowledge not all research can translate into uptake into policy. Some of the research may be just set the frontiers of knowledge, the next level. That's innovative. But the research we're looking at here is whether there can be a lot of engagement right from the start of the research program to ensure that the stakeholders, the policy stakeholders and private sector are part of the research program. They are designed within the research program. And indeed, that for the private sector entities, actually, we can be able to listen their problems and co-design. And a number of examples, good examples, have already been in place. Current projects, for example, supported by Gates Foundation between the government of Kenya, Danida, and government of Kenya and government of Ethiopia in terms of how to implement, how to design tax systems or public finance management, which is in place. Another dimension will change was the governance and organizational structure. And here, a key issue is to put in place a research advisory committee. This will be a small committee of 5 people that I'll be working with There are 5 individuals who have or demonstrated that they have on their radar developments across the globe and developments in Africa. In other words, even if they wake up at 2 a.m. in their gym jam, they can say, actually, it's critical minerals. Actually, it's this issue. We don't have a program on critical minerals, for example, in the AERC, in the African Economic Research Consortium. Even when the critical minerals were underpinning the fragility in East Africa and Central Africa, and also in the global dimension, global geopolitics. Okay, so these 5 individuals will be the one to be able to bounce the ideas off and create input, and rotating every 2 years. Okay, and this is a new structure within the AERC. The network membership is critical. I've been active, and I can see a number of people here who've been very active in the AERC, normally in thematic groups. I chaired Group C, which is finance and resource mobilization, for more than 10 years. Even when I was working at the African Development Bank, I still was belonging as a member of the AERC. But what about the formalization of membership? We just worked with 3 interns in Nairobi to be able to put together the first ever database of who has worked with the AERC, who is a member of the AERC. And so we have, for example, in training, we have for every African country, the research universities involved, for every university, the economics department members, head of department, what are they producing in the last 10 years? The members of faculty, what have they produced in 10 years? Which shows you the specialism of their work and also the gravitas of their work. So we have that in membership. What about in policy making? So using this database, we are creating the acknowledgement, for example, the first ever fellows as a fellow of the AERC. So when they are signing off their name, Victor Marine Africa, names a fellow of the AERC. And we awarded the first batch. This is not the last batch. The first batch, the initial batch in December 2024. And the system is in place for these fellows to be able to create every evaluation, maybe every 6 months, and then keep on awarding fellows. For the early career researchers, they become associates of the AERC. For those PhDs, masters, and other students also become affiliates of the AERC. So we can be able to define your membership of the AERC, but they also the founding fathers of the AERC who are still around. Very few are still around, unfortunately, but those who are still around get the medal, Distinguished Service Award, which we are issuing very shortly during June, or the Distinguished Service Award of the work recognition of the work they did. They did a lot of sacrifice, people working 24/7 to make the ERC happen. And we need everlasting control, the recognition of the work. This is the membership that will be, and then the formalization of membership of institutions. Like Afrexim Bank is an institutional member of the ERC. Or FCDO is an institutional member of the ERC. This is the membership and strategic partnership that we have. Then, of course, going on a strategic membership into bodies like, ASSET, which is Ghana, that's the African Center of Economic Transformation. Very, very, very doing some excellent work. The partnership for economic policy headed by one of the alumni of ERC, the Economic Research Forum in Egypt. The idea, World Bank Institute, we're already doing work with them, IMF Institute, the African Development Bank also Institute. This is the strategic partnerships that we embed and recognize and give voice and space of work. Resource mobilization, we're going to cover that in the panel discussion. As the ground has shifted, we anticipated this would happen, but not so quickly. And what are we to do? What can be done? And that will be a discussion focusing on this, but let me just highlight it. And geographical inclusion. The mission of the ERC is to serve the whole of the African continent and link the African continent research in economics to the rest of the world. Okay. So there has to be a lot of inclusion. The rest of the world does not only mean the North America, Europe, but also means in Asia, and in the rest of the world. So we make that happen also to make sure that we're inclusive, both whether African countries are Lusophone, Anglophone, or Francophone. This is kind of a dichotomy that exists on the African continent. We want to be kind of inclusive. And so inclusion, geographic inclusion, is a very important aspect of the ERC going forward. Finally, we do a pre-mortem. We stand in March 2035 and then peer backwards. In the language of Nairobi, where the ERC is headquartered, it is chungulia. You look backwards and see, what is it that could happen that might derail the ERC from achieving these goals through the period from 2035? We identify 3 risks. And please, if you can identify risk number 4, please feel free to contribute to that. The 3 risks we anticipate is number 1, the funding landscape. And it has come, the funding landscape has shifted. That could derail the ERC. Something has to be done. And our opponents will contribute to this debate on what can be done, and of course the ideas of what needs to be done. African governments and African entities, African institutions, including the African Development Bank, African, have a stake in the ERC. Okay, and they have to stand up now to contribute to this. So that is a real serious in our analysis, in our pre-mortem analysis of the potential risk. The second risk is the capacity of the Secretariat. The skills for achieving the 10-year strategic plan are different from the skill set required when we are doing this work for the last 30 years. We are undertaking a comprehensive review of the skill set of our current Secretariat. But we also need to build a framework where we are working with the support of all the network members I can see here and those who are not here, to bring in their skills and work with the ERC. It could be you are taking a sabbatical from Oxford or Cape Town and spending 3 months at the ERC to be able to bring your skill sets, the work of the ERC. That is most welcome. And I can see for all these young people, I always feel very, 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 very comforted when I see a lot of young people in front of me, because it makes things that there is actually the destiny of the ERC is in good hands. And basically, it's possible that you can take a sabbatical for 1 year in what you are doing, or you can actually bring your skills and work with the ERC, indeed, during this 10-year strategy. So this is kind of a invitation to address a potential risk, number 2, in the pre-mortem. Number 3 in the pre-mortem analysis is, of course, the political governance risk. And we mentioned the fragility in Eastern and Central Africa. That is for real. And there has to be a way of diversifying. I remember when I joined the African Development Bank, it was a time when they had this risk, the governance for risk. For many years, the African Development Bank was based in Abidjan, in Côte d'Ivoire. Then Côte d'Ivoire went to war. And for the first time, it was real. Actually, we don't have regional headquarters. We're operating from the same area. And subsequently, now you have strong regional centers of the African Development Bank in West Africa, in North Africa, in Central Africa, based in Nairobi, and South Africa, based in Pretoria. So there has to be a way of creating that diversity and de-risking the single focus of headquarters in one area. So these are on our way. So, in conclusion, I'm sorry, taking a bit longer, but the ERC is embarking on a new direction of travel and needs you, each one of us. So, all hands on the deck, and your involvement in this transformation is very much required and appreciated. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So on the so as I mentioned that state, this is like a 2-stage drama. whereby we present the direction and vision of the ERC going forward. And we move now to the panel discussion. We are delighted to have a distinguished panel of members who have been very active in the ERC. I think it's helpful if we just briefly highlight the introduction of these members. I think I can't do justice to them because they are people with a lot of achievements. But we are pleased to have here Professor Ingrid Woolard on my left. How do I introduce Ingrid? She is the Executive Dean of the University of Sussex Business School since January this year. And before that, she was the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Management Sciences at Stellenbosch University in South Africa. In fact, the first woman to hold that position in the 99-year-old history of the faculty at Stellenbosch. She holds a BSc in Mathematical Sciences from KwaZulu-Natal and different degrees also from Cape Town. She's also has been and she's still an honorary professor of economics of poverty and inequality at Groningen University in the Netherlands. So twinning to you becomes very natural. The twinning process we have. She's a research fellow of the Institute of Labor Economics in Bonn, a non-resident fellow of UNU, wider in Helsinki, and research associate in the Commitment to Equity Institute at Trent University in New Orleans. She has also played key critical roles as advisor to economics ministers in South Africa for a long period, say from 2008 to the present, various ministries. So she has a stint of academic excellence and also policy engagement at the highest level of the country. So let's welcome Professor Ingrid Woolard. I also have the pleasure of introducing on my right Professor Robert Mudida. In one word, Robert is ERC and a good friend, okay? But just in full, he is now the chief economist and the director of the research department at the Central Bank of Kenya, and also a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Kenya. He's a member of the Royal Economic Society and Society for Financial Econometrics, a seasoned economist, has more than 2 decades of experience in macroeconomic and applied econometric research and capacity building in many, many areas of economics, but also has served as a lead consultant to several projects in various institutions, including the World Bank, the United Nations Commission for Africa, the financial sector deepening, governments, including the Kenyan government as well as the Ugandan government. And he has also been awarded the IMF Academic Fellowship for his research on economic issues. And prior to joining the Central Bank of Kenya, Professor Mudida was the professor of political economy and director of the Institute of Public Policy and Governance at Strathmore University. And one last word. I rely heavily on Mudida for second opinion, 24/7. He never lets me down. So let me introduce to you Professor Robert Mudida. And last but not least, he is our very own, right? Dr. Abi Kadir. Dr. Abi plays a critical role in this transformation that we've just highlighted. And indeed has been at the core of authoring that transformation, because he's the director of research at the African Economic Research Consortium and heads that research body and the transformational and all the network of the ERC. He did his undergraduate work at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia and his MSc and PhD from the School of Economics at the University of Nottingham. Indeed, worked with very distinguished people I can see here, especially Andy. We recognize you for being able to mentor one of the great brains that is transforming the ERC. He joined the African Economic Research Consortium about 6 months before me. Joined in 2023 from the University of Sheffield in here in the UK, where he was a linear academic. But he has also had long service interactions with the governments, especially government of Ethiopia, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, on various assignments, the World Bank, UNDP, UN Women and African Development Bank, and others. So he's been very active, absolutely, in many areas of economic work. And he's been prolific in terms of publishing and also supporting editorial boards of a number of journals, the Journal of Development Studies, for example, right now, and is co-authoring together with the Professor Oliver Morris at Nottingham and Professor Joshua Boa at the University of Ghana on what will become one of the path-breaking work full of ideas on shaping development economics and development finance in Africa. Please, let's welcome. So, we are pleased to have the three distinguished panelists. What I will do is just direct some questions around to be able to start the discussion in some certain area. The first one, as I highlighted when I make a presentation, what is on your radar? What really are the key critical economic challenges Africa is facing today? Could somebody just to get an insight into these problems and also to excite members of the audience later to come in and share with us some of the problems on their radar. What is on your radar in terms of economic challenges and economic problems facing the African continent? Maybe I've turned and look to Professor Mudida in this area.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot, Prof. Murinde. It's a great pleasure to be here at St. Catherine's College, Oxford, and thanks a lot for the invitation. So Africa's problems are complex, multifaceted. We could say a lot of progress has been made over the last few decades, but I think a lot still remains to be done. And as a policy maker, I would say we're always thinking through these issues. Whenever we have our Monetary Policy Committee meetings at the central bank, we're always confronted with these issues in one way or another, and are always trying to see how to adapt to them and how to contribute towards solving them. So I put them in several categories. I think the first one is a long-standing issue, which is the issue of inclusive growth in African countries, or the lack of it in quite a number of African countries. And if you look at IMF projections this year, for example, African countries are expected to grow roughly by 4.2%. This is an improvement from last year. Last year, the estimated growth maybe was about 3.8%. If you remove two of the big countries, that's South Africa and Nigeria, which have been struggling quite a bit, that growth goes up to about, expected growth to about 5.5%. But a big question is, how inclusive is this growth? Yeah. And you realize that in many African countries still, let's say large segments of the population are excluded from gaining from the benefits of this growth. There are issues at quite a number of levels. I think the most fundamental one in many cases is institutions that in many African countries, despite a lot of progress made, we still don't have inclusive institutions. Many institutions are still extractive in many of these countries, and this hinders, let's say, promotion of further inclusive growth. There are also other challenges, in informal sectors in many African economies are quite large. So whereas these are important for job creation, for informal sector job creation, many of these jobs are not really very stable and still large, even though these jobs contribute to economic growth, they contribute to employment, you still find that many segments of the population are still very vulnerable. And underlying also many challenges in Africa's economies is the question of innovation. There are some sectors where you've seen quite some innovation, but many critical sectors, for example, the manufacturing sector, still continues in many African economies to struggle. You don't have enough product process innovation. There's a lack of an industrial policy, as Prof. Murindi alluded to, said the importance of having an industrial policy. So many still lack a way of coordinated, let's say, development among the sectors. So then, because of that, we're not able to enter, global value chains effectively in many areas. In fact, now the challenge for many economies has been trying to enter regional value chains effectively, take advantage of the African continental free trade area. But still, there's a big challenge for many African economies in terms of trying to access global value chains in many critical areas, and this limits growth. So that's one broad area which is very complex and I know has been studied by many of you in different respects. Now going to an area we as policymakers also deal with a lot is macroeconomic instability. You'd say that in some respects, having come from the COVID shock just a few years ago, where there was considerable macroeconomic vulnerability in many African countries, many countries were actually recovering in the last 2-3 years. And now it seems we're about to enter into another phase of global shocks. But you'd say that there's been quite some progress in terms of economic reform that's enhanced macroeconomic stability in quite a number of African states, but vulnerabilities still remain. Just looking at a few different domains briefly, because I'm just setting the scene, is the fiscal domain. The fiscal domain, fiscal challenges in many African countries still persist. You've had quite some fiscal consolidation because quite a number of African countries are on IMF programs. And so that's led to some fiscal consolidation. Of course, we've had cases of countries that had such severe debt challenges that they had to go for debt restructuring. But despite progress made in the area of fiscal consolidation by many African countries, critical challenges remain. One of the biggest ones is debt service. You find in many African countries, debt service is about 20 to 30% of revenue, which means that less and less is left every year for development spending, critical development spending. Most revenue goes to debt service and recurrent spending. And the amount going to development spending to achieve critical outcomes like health outcomes, educational outcomes has been declining, consistently. So on the surface, even though you see some fiscal consolidation outcomes improving, when you actually analyze the data in greater detail, you realize in many countries, actually, there are critical development outcomes that are suffering. Of course, many African countries in the last 2-3 years have been able to have gained access again to international capital markets, for example, Eurobond markets, which is a good thing. It speaks of some confidence in the economies. But the challenge is then that then you have to borrow at commercial interest rates. And then already burdened by high debt service, then this tends to complicate the picture of debt service quite considerably. On the monetary front, and this is the one that I'm more directly involved in as a policymaker, There's been also some progress in the last couple of years. You'd say about half of the countries, if we talk now more specifically about sub-Saharan Africa, you can say have the inflation within their target bands after having come from very high inflation about three years ago. Now, inflation is more within the target band, but you still have a number of countries that are struggling with about, say, 20% of countries in sub-Saharan Africa are still struggling with double-digit rates of inflation. And because many African economies are open economies, you find whenever you have global shocks, we tend to be particularly vulnerable, being small open economies. So shocks are beginning to emerge again this year. Sure, you've followed closely. Let's say increased U.S. protectionism and the impact that is likely to have. Of course, what this is going to mean is levels of inflation are going to go up, including in advanced economies. This is going to feed through into quite a number of critical areas, commodity prices, and many other critical areas. And generally, although this was expected initially to be a year of declining inflation, now there are new inflationary pressures that are emerging, and pass-through. The pass-through tends to be, especially the exchange rate pass-through, tends to be quite significant, and food pass-through, global food price pass-through. So we are again entering an era where we now need to be concerned about inflation. Of course, what this will mean is once you have higher interest rates in key advanced economy central banks, then that's going to mean higher for longer interest rates, which will mean probably stronger currencies, for example, stronger US dollar, which will mean weakening currencies, greater depreciation in currencies of African countries, hence exchange rate pass-through and critical concerns. So just saying that even though we were, getting out of the woods on the inflationary front, now some concerns are starting to re-emerge. Same thing you could say about the external balance side. That's another critical component of macro stability. Current account deficits had started declining, going to 4-5% of GDP, more manageable levels. But again, challenges are beginning to emerge with potential weakening of currencies. Then you're likely to see some deterioration there. You still have about a third of the countries in Africa that still have reserves below 3 months of import cover, which is considered sort of a minimum for the economic size and openness of those kind of countries. So you're going to see global shocks potentially also having an impact, leading to deteriorating external sector balances in these countries. So on the macro front, whenever you have global shocks being anticipated, then this is always a point of vulnerability. Of course, climate shocks continue to exert a very critical influence. They continue to really occupy the minds of policymakers because you have both extremes. You have floods at certain times that create a lot of damage, and then you have droughts. So in several countries in Southern Africa, for example, last year, you had severe drought. In several countries in Eastern Africa last year, you had floods. So you have the different extremes. So as a policymaker, you're always thinking about climate shocks and the impacts that they have. So I mentioned a couple of other problems briefly. I think one of the big ones, and I think one of my fellow panelists will talk about the consequences in greater detail, so I won't go into this, but is saying the one of unexpected fluctuations in development financing. Just to say with, already aid was being reassessed in quite a number of advanced economies, but of course with the US aid sort of cutting back of 85% of the aid from USA, this is going to have devastating consequences for the African continent. That was a big beneficiary. Britain, for example, is expected to reduce its aid funding by 40%. France, which is a big, development partner in Africa, is expected to reduce it by a third. This is, of course, in line with geopolitical alignments also, because now security concerns are critical. And so now there's going to be increased defense spending and, of course, less for aid. China, which is another option, it's been a critical, say, development partner for many African states. Now, of course, is struggling, projected to grow at less than 5% this year again. So just saying that that's a difficult situation, but my fellow panelists will talk about those consequences in greater detail. The geopolitics is worsening, increased protectionism. You have fragility in many critical parts of the world at the moment. In the Middle East, the ceasefire that was ongoing there for a few weeks now is again sort of really threatened. The reemergence of conflict in Syria. Russia, Ukraine, we're still not clear how that's going to develop. This is likely to have supply chain impacts that could lead to resurgence of inflation, and these are all critical developments, because the realignments, of course, in the geopolitical space, greater concerns about security then lead to very important changes. Yeah. But in addition to that, and I close on this note, in terms of giving the background, you've had a resurgence of conflicts in a number of African countries. In Central Africa, in the DR Congo, we've had a resurgence of conflict there. In countries that had been stable for several years, like South Sudan, I have seen in recent weeks again, a conflict is flaring up there. Of course, Sudan itself also has had a conflict. The Sahel region, the countries that are there, still very fragile. So conflicts have profound development consequences, adverse consequences, and make it very difficult to achieve any of the previous outcomes that we talked about. In conflict states tend to have very, very fragile economies. Development outcomes are usually among the worst that you have on the continent. Health, education, economic growth, and all others tend to really worsen in situations of conflict. So these are sort of the multifaceted challenges that we face at the moment, and that's kind of a sense of this, and this is what we're thinking a lot about as policymakers this year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Great coverage of the main issues and challenges facing the African continent. I think I'll build on what you mentioned, especially with respect of a donor or aid challenges, and set this question on what are the consequences of the current wave of cuts and the reallocations in humanitarian development aid by major donors around the world. And this I direct none other than Abi.
Okay, thank you, Victor. I think let me start with a footnote, or one or two. The first one is it is going to be a gloomy discussion when it comes to consequences, because they are more or less clearer, but they will be data driven. In the coming weeks we will get a lot of information about what implications they are bringing to us, and I think it is an opportunity also to rethink the way we develop, and you are part of it. We will be agonizing over how we can really rethink the development of Africa as we go along together. The second item that I will say is that the consequences of what we see now, which are very dramatic, is not really restricted to Africa. Even advanced countries are feeling it. I think that is another important footnote, because the reallocation and the cuts are affecting across the board several individuals. Maybe the last one as a footnote is that when I first joined the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, my first assignment was to assess the economic impact of Ebola. And we were saying a lot about we have to fix our health systems. We didn't, because we always outsource our health systems, outsource our education, outsource our security, but we can't continue like that. And COVID came when I was at the University of Sheffield, COVID-19, and we said we have to fix our health system. But if you look back, the aid to government expenditure ratio, still we rely on aid. We didn't fix that. So that is the context we are working under. Therefore, just to answer the question or the questions that Victor posed, the consequences are immediate, severe, and catastrophic, or any adjectives that you might have. Because I would be lying to you if I say that the cuts are not really affecting lives. I think I sit as a director of research. In my department, one project was financed by the USAID, and I had to say goodbye to members of staff, which is very, very difficult. So, to be honest, these immediate, catastrophic, and severe consequences are very, very real. So we are destroying careers, livelihoods, and in terms of the health consequences, I think morbidity and mortality are also very real. In the long run, we will see what is going to happen to hospitals across Africa. I think the consequences are not restricted only to lives, careers, and morbidity and mortality within Africa, but fragility increases. And that might have implications in terms of migration, what electorates in the UK and other places are worried about, because they always say we have to close our borders and we don't need migrants. I don't think the planet is going to be safe if we continue like this. Maybe lastly, in the interest of time, research also suffers. I serve as a director of research, and projects are cut. Therefore, there are life-changing research, which was even highlighted from the evidence of the DHS, which led to a lot of developments of national nutrition and health plans, which was stopped. I think when I checked late January as well as February, access to DHS data was barred. So research centers and think tanks will go under because some of them are exclusively funded by these institutions. As I said, it is a bit gloomy. However, I think it is an opportunity also for us to rethink. And I think that is a message I have when it comes to consequences.
Thanks very much, Avi, for sharing with us an insight into the consequences on which we can build the discussion. Of course, this discussion can go on for, but yes, the consequences are real. Hans Grome, absolutely agree. Now, let me build on this and pose a speculative question to you, Ingrid. What can or what should policymakers or African governments do? So let's say take an excursion into this particular area. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Perhaps just to add to the adjectives that Avi used, I think we can refer to the US aid cuts as cruel. I don't think this is just devastating. I think it's gratuitously cruel. People will die. The notion that one can simply cut aid immediately is just extraordinary. And so I think it's difficult to say, well, what do we do in response to that? Because this is such an enormous exogenous shock that could not have in any way been anticipated. So in some countries, there's been some ability to try to plug gaps. So to give an example from South Africa, people will receive their ARVs, but that's had knock-on effects for other parts of the budget. But people will get ARVs, but there are no community workers to distribute those ARVs. All that infrastructure that was built up is simply decimated. So perhaps to turn then to the question that I was asked, well, what are then the pressing things that we do in the near future? And so I think this list of topics that Victor put up they're a great list of topics, but I want to focus on perhaps two things that I think the current crisis means we need to focus on perhaps a little more immediately. So the one is around domestic resource mobilization. We now know that we can't rely on aid in the way we relied on aid in the past. So even before this crisis, the African Development Bank had estimated that there was a financing gap of about $400 billion by 2030. That gap is now even bigger. African countries over the past decades have simply not done what they needed to do to increase tax capacity. So we see, for example, that in 2010, the average tax to GDP ratio was 16%. Today, it's 14%. Some people talk about this sort of magic number that if your tax to GDP ratio is less than 15%, you really have no possibility of reaching the SDGs. 34 countries in Africa have tax to GDP ratios below 15%. So we need to urgently think about how do we increase tax capacity, how do we increase efficiency in the way in which taxes are collected, and we need to think hard about the social contract that we have with citizens. I think in a way that's the hardest question, is how do you get to the point where you have a social contract with people such that they think that there is a reason to pay taxes? Every country in Africa struggles with this. The IDS did a very interesting study in which they talk about using Afrobarometer data. They talk about the fact that people view taxes similar to bribes. They see them as coercive and unnecessary. They don't see them as part of citizenship, something that you need to do to contribute towards the growth of your own society. And I think if we can't address that issue, then the other issues are always going to be very hard. So these things are interconnected. We need to deal with corruption. We need to think hard about how we increase people's perceptions of how their money is spent. Well, not just their perceptions. We need to spend money better, such that people have a better experience of government services. So let me stop there on the subject of domestic resource mobilization. But I do think that that's a key topic, particularly given where we find ourselves. And then the other thing, Victor, that I thought perhaps we want to pull out more strongly is a focus on gender, perhaps as a cross-cutting theme through all of these topics. So we know that we get tremendous returns on investing in women. We've had some successes in Africa. So, for example, the primary school gender gap has now disappeared. So that we can take that as a win. But there are still a lot of impediments to women's participation in the labour market, women's access to ownership of property and land, women's rights, women's access to women's reproductive rights. So I think all of those things are actually things that can be quite quick wins in terms of, they touch on a range of things that need to happen. But I think that a strong focus on gender in the new agenda for AERC would be incredibly valuable. It touches on everything. It touches on entrepreneurship, on education, on the labour market, on healthcare, and I think all of these things can. We need to see what is it that we haven't yet managed to do for women in Africa. But let me stop there. Thank you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Very great insight into what governments can do, and especially focus. We are kind of running out of time. I don't know whether there's a timekeeper here who is. Stop. Okay. And I know you have great questions. Maybe could I take at least one? Oh.
Take one.
One, thank you. Thank you.
Good negotiation.
Yeah. Just only one.
Sorry.
That means the first hand to shoot up. Yeah, exactly. Okay. No hands. Okay. I think what this means is that we shall have great interactions throughout the day on the feedback on some of these questions and over the next couple of days. In summary, one idea that has cut across the three areas of key issues, the consequences, and strategies is public financial management. And the other. So I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank you, the audience, who will continue to provide ideas on this. Thank you very much for this great session.